When Marcus Sullivan placed a $1 bid on an abandoned cathedral in the mountains of Colorado, he thought he was buying a place to hide from the world that had forgotten him, but what he found buried beneath the altar was a secret so dangerous, so valuable, that people had killed to protect it for over 70 years. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will absolutely blow your mind. The snow fell heavy on the courthouse steps in Pine Ridge, Colorado, that December morning in 2021. It was the kind of snow that muffled sound and made the world feel smaller, quieter, like nature was trying to give everyone permission to start over. Marcus Sullivan stood at the back of the small crowd, his left leg aching from the cold, the metal pins in his knee sending sharp reminders of that roadside bomb outside Kandahar 3 years ago. At 34, Marcus looked older than his years. His brown hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples, and deep lines bracketed his green eyes, carved there by months of sleepless nights and memories that visited him, whether he wanted them or not. The purple heart and bronze star in his apartment dresser drawer felt like artifacts from someone else's life, tokens of a man who had once believed his service mattered, who had once thought coming home would mean something more than counting pills and marking time until the next nightmare. He wasn't supposed to be at this auction. Hell, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere except his small apartment on the edge of town, where the walls were thin enough that he could hear his elderly neighbor's television through the night, and where the rent was cheap enough that his disability check almost covered it. But something about the auction notice in the local paper had caught his eye, maybe the desperate tone of the legal language, or the way it seemed like the city was trying to get rid of something they didn't want to deal with anymore. The courthouse steps were slick with ice, and the 20 or so people gathered there stamped their feet and pulled their coats tighter against the wind that came down from the mountains, like a promise of harder weather to come. Most of them looked like locals, ranchers and retirees, and the kind of people who showed up to these things out of curiosity rather than any real intention to buy. Marcus recognized a few faces from the diner where he sometimes ate breakfast when the silence in his apartment became too loud, but nobody recognized him. He was good at being invisible, had been practicing it since he got back. The auctioneer was a thin man in a wool coat who kept checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. His name was Robert Clemens, according to the badge on his chest, and he looked like he'd rather be selling used cars than standing on courthouse steps in a snowstorm, dealing with property nobody wanted. "All right, folks," Robert called out, his voice echoing off the stone steps. "Let's get this moving before we all freeze to death. We've got 17 properties on the docket today, most of them tax liens and municipal seizures. First up, lot number 1, residential property on Maple Street, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, needs work." Marcus half listened as the properties were auctioned off one by one. A trailer with a collapsed roof went for $300. A vacant lot where a gas station used to stand brought $800. The bidding was usually quick, practical people, making practical decisions about practical problems. But when they got to lot 17, something shifted in the crowd's energy. "Next item," Robert announced, pulling out a folder that looked thicker than the others. Lot 17. St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, 12 acres, built 1907, vacant since 1978. Property includes the main cathedral structure, rectory, and outbuildings. Property is sold as is. Buyer responsible for all back taxes and liens, totaling approximately $37,000. He paused, looking around the crowd with the expression of a man about to deliver bad news. Now, I'm required to inform potential bidders that this property has certain, shall we say, complications. The building has been vacant for 43 years following what city records describe as unusual circumstances. Multiple attempts to develop or demolish the property have been unsuccessful due to various legal challenges, and a murmur went through the crowd. Marcus saw people exchange glances, the kind of looks that passed between locals who all knew the same story but nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud. What kind of incidents? Called out a woman in a red coat. Robert shuffled through his papers uncomfortably. Well, according to city records, there have been several accidents over the years. Construction crews refusing to work on the site, equipment malfunctions, that sort of thing. Nothing that would prevent legal ownership. You understand. Just complications. Tell them about Father Kellner. Someone muttered from the middle of the crowd. Robert's jaw tightened. The previous occupant, Father Thomas Kellner, left under circumstances that remain unclear. That's all the city records indicate. Left? The same voice called out. Louder now. Man disappeared. More like. Middle of winter, 1978. Never found his body. Robert cleared his throat loudly. As I said, the previous occupant is no longer in residence. The property is being sold as is, with clear title, starting bid $1. Do I have $1? Silence. Marcus looked around at the faces in the crowd, saw the way people were backing away from the auctioneer, like he was offering to sell them a haunted house. Which, he supposed, he was. Come on, folks, Robert said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. 12 acres of prime mountain property, historic building, stone construction. Do I hear $1? More silence. A few people had started walking back to their cars. Marcus didn't know what made him do it. Maybe it was the way the auctioneer looked so defeated. Or maybe it was the photograph in the auction papers showing a Gothic cathedral that looked like it belonged in a European fairy tale instead of the Colorado mountains. Maybe it was just that he had $1 in his pocket and nothing else worth spending it on. He raised his hand. Robert looked surprised, like he'd forgotten anyone was still listening. $1 to the gentleman in the back. Do I hear $2? Silence. Going once, Robert called, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. Going twice. He looked around hopefully, but nobody else moved. Sold to bidder number 47 for $1. Just like that. Marcus Sullivan owned a cathedral. The clerk who handled the paperwork was a middle-aged woman named Dorothy, who had the efficient manner of someone who'd been dealing with municipal bureaucracy for decades. She handed him a deed and a single brass key, so tarnished, it looked like it had been pulled from a shipwreck. Congratulations, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. You know why nobody else bid, right? Marcus shook his head, studying the key. It was heavier than it looked, made from solid brass and worn smooth in places, like it had been handled frequently over many years. Place has been empty since 1978, Dorothy explained, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. Father Kellner was the last person to live there. Nice man. According to folks who knew him, quiet, kept to himself, spent most of his time working on historical research. Then one day, he just vanished. Middle of December. Snowstorm just like this one. Left everything behind, even his car. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Search and rescue looked for weeks. Never found a trace. Some folks say he wandered off in the storm and died of exposure. Others think something else happened to him. What do you think? Dorothy shrugged. I think a man doesn't live in the same place for 22 years and then just decide to take a walk in a blizzard without a coat. But that's just me. She handed him another set of papers. City's been trying to tear the place down for decades. But every time they get close, something stops them. Lawsuits, injunctions, accidents. 3 years ago, they sent a demolition crew up there. Foreman said the building gave him the creeps, refused to finish the job. Last year, a developer tried to turn it into a conference center, pulled out after 2 weeks. Wouldn't say why. Accidents, equipment failures, mostly. Generators that wouldn't start, vehicles that broke down on the access road, tools that went missing. Nothing you could call supernatural, exactly. Just unlucky. She studied his face. You sure you want to go through with this? Marcus looked at the deed in his hands. At his name, written in legal script next to a property description that included the words Gothic Cathedral, stone construction, circa 1907. 3 days ago, he'd been nobody. A broken veteran collecting disability and trying to figure out how to fill the empty hours between sunset and sunrise. Now he owned 12 acres of mountain property and a building that sounded like it belonged in a horror movie. Yeah, he said. The drive up to the cathedral took 45 minutes on winding mountain roads that hadn't been properly maintained in years. Marcus's beat-up Ford pickup struggled with the grade, its engine coughing in the thin air as they climbed through pine forests that seemed to close in around the narrow asphalt. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that melted on his windshield faster than the ancient wipers could clear them. He almost missed the turnoff. There was no sign, just a gap in the trees where a gravel road disappeared into the forest. According to the directions Dorothy had given him, this was the access road to the cathedral property. It looked more like a hiking trail than something meant for vehicles. But his truck had 4-wheel drive, and he'd driven through worse in Afghanistan. The gravel road wound through the trees for nearly a mile, before opening into a clearing that took his breath away. The cathedral sat in the center of the open space like something from another world, its gray stone walls rising from the snow-covered ground, with the kind of presence that made everything else seem small and temporary. It was bigger than he'd expected from the auction photos, built from blocks of local granite that had weathered decades of mountain storms without losing their sharp edges. Gothic arches stretched toward the sky, their peaks disappearing into the low clouds that clung to the mountainside. Stained glass windows lined the walls, their colors muted by the snow and shadows but still beautiful, still somehow alive despite the emptiness behind them. The bell tower rose above the main structure, like a finger pointing toward heaven, its bronze bells visible through arched openings near the top. Gargoyles perched at the corners of the building, their faces worn smooth by wind and time, but still recognizable as guardians, watchers, protectors of whatever secrets the building might hold. Marcus parked in what had once been a courtyard and stepped out into the silence. The only sounds were his boots, crunching in the snow, and the distant whisper of wind through the pine trees. Even the snow seemed to fall more quietly here, as if the very air was holding its breath. The front doors were massive, carved from dark oak, and reinforced with iron hinges that looked like they could have been made by medieval blacksmiths. The brass key turned easier than it should have after 43 years of neglect, the tumblers clicking into place with the sound of a mechanism that had been built to last centuries rather than decades. The doors opened with a groan that echoed through the nave, like the building itself was waking up. Marcus stepped inside and immediately understood why the demolition crews had refused to finish their work. The cathedral was magnificent, Shafts of colored light filtered through stained glass windows 30 feet above the floor, painting the interior in blues and reds and gold that seemed to shift and dance with each movement of the clouds outside. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar, their surfaces dusty but intact, carved from what looked like solid oak and polished to a deep shine that had somehow survived 4 decades of abandonment. Above him, vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow, supported by stone arches that demonstrated the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. Carved angels looked down from the capitals of columns, their faces serene and watchful. High in the darkness, he could hear the flutter of wings, bats, probably, disturbed by his presence, but not yet ready to flee. The air was cold but not damp, dry, and still with the faint scent of old wood and stone dust. It didn't smell abandoned. It smelled preserved, like someone had been taking care of it all these years, even though everyone claimed it had been empty since 1978. Marcus walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing off stone walls in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Every surface showed signs of careful construction, from the hand-carved moldings around the windows to the intricate stonework that decorated the altar area. This wasn't just a church. It was a masterpiece, the kind of building that would have taken years to complete and cost a fortune even when it was built. So why had it been abandoned? And why had nobody else wanted to buy it? At the altar, he stopped and looked up at a massive crucifix carved from dark wood, its Christ figure staring down with eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved. Behind the cross, a stained glass window showed the resurrection, Christ rising from the tomb while angels sang and the earth shook. The artistry was breathtaking, the kind of work that belonged in cathedrals in Rome or Paris, not tucked away in the Colorado mountains, where only the trees could see it. To the left of the altar, a doorway led to what had probably been the priest's quarters. Marcus pushed through and found himself in a smaller room lined with empty bookshelves. Dust motes danced in the light from a single window, and the silence was so complete he could hear his own breathing. A stone staircase spiraled upward toward the bell tower, and another led down into darkness. He tried the upward stairs first, climbing carefully on steps worn smooth by decades of use. The staircase ended in a room filled with ropes and pulleys that controlled the bells, massive bronze instruments that hung silent in their wooden framework. Everything looked functional, like someone could walk in and start ringing the hours again without any preparation. Back downstairs, Marcus stood at the entrance to the lower level and hesitated. His phone's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing stone steps that descended into what looked like a basement or storage area. Something about the darkness down there felt different from the shadows in the main cathedral, heavier somehow, like it was hiding something important. He descended carefully, his injured leg protesting with each step. The air grew colder as he went deeper, and he caught a scent that didn't belong in an abandoned building. Something metallic and sharp beneath the mustiness of age, like copper pennies left in rain. The basement was larger than he'd expected, a maze of stone chambers that stretched under the foundation of the cathedral. Most were empty, their walls carved from the same granite as the building above, but one room near the back contained wooden crates stacked against the walls. The crates looked old but well-maintained, their surfaces free of the dust that covered everything else. Marcus approached the nearest crate and found that its lid wasn't nailed down, just held in place by metal clasps that turned easily in his hands. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that looked like it had been recently replaced, was a chalice made of what appeared to be solid gold. His hands trembled as he lifted it from the crate. The cup was heavier than he'd expected, its surface covered with intricate engravings that caught his flashlight beam like tiny stars. The base was inscribed with Latin words he couldn't read, and the stem was decorated with religious scenes that looked like they'd been carved by a master craftsman. Jewels, real jewels, not glass or paste, were set into the rim, catching the light and throwing it back in patterns that made his eyes water. This wasn't just valuable. This was priceless, the kind of artifact that should have been in the Vatican or the Smithsonian, not hidden in the basement of an abandoned cathedral in Colorado. Marcus set the chalice down carefully and opened another crate. This one contained manuscripts, hand-illuminated books with pages made from vellum, their texts written in languages he couldn't identify. But that looked ancient, older than anything he'd ever seen outside of a museum. Some of the books were bound in leather that had been dyed deep purple, with gold clasps and covers decorated with precious stones. A third crate held paintings, religious icons painted on wood and canvas, with the kind of skill that spoke of master artists working at the height of their powers. Some were small enough to fit in his palm. Intimate portraits of saints, with faces so realistic they seemed to be watching him. Others were large enough to hang above an altar, depicting biblical scenes with a richness of color and detail that made his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Marcus sat back on his heels, trying to process what he was seeing. He'd expected to find maybe some old church supplies, forgotten furniture, the accumulated junk that any building would collect over decades of abandonment. Instead, he'd discovered what looked like the contents of a major museum, artifacts worth more money than he could imagine, hidden beneath a cathedral that nobody wanted to own. But why? Why would someone abandon such valuable items? Why leave them here to gather dust while the cathedral fell into disrepair? And why had Father Kellner, a simple parish priest in a town that barely existed, been in possession of treasures that looked like they belonged to kings and popes? He was so focused on the artifacts that he almost missed the sound. It was faint at first, like footsteps on the floor above, but that was impossible. He was alone, had been alone since he'd arrived at the cathedral. The building had been empty for 43 years, according to everyone he'd talked to. But there it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone moving around in the nave above. Not the settling of an old building or the scurrying of small animals, but deliberate footsteps, purposeful movement, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and why they were there. Marcus turned off his flashlight and listened, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps were moving from the front of the cathedral toward the back, slow and measured, like someone conducting a careful search. They stopped directly above him, and in the silence that followed, he could swear he heard breathing. Then a voice called out, echoing off the stone walls with an authority that made his blood turn cold. "Marcus Sullivan, we know you're down there. Come up slowly, hands visible. We just want to talk." His mouth went dry. Nobody knew he was here. He'd bought the place on impulse, hadn't told anyone about the auction, hadn't even decided whether he was going to keep the property or try to sell it back to the city. So how did they know his name? And who were they? Marcus quickly rewrapped the chalice and closed the crate, his hands shaking as he tried to process what was happening. Whatever he'd stumbled into, it was bigger than an abandoned church, and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The treasures hidden in these crates weren't just valuable. They were important enough that someone had been watching the cathedral, waiting for whoever was brave enough or foolish enough to buy it and start exploring. He climbed the stairs as quietly as possible, his injured leg screaming with each step, but his training kicking in. The old instincts from Afghanistan telling him to move carefully, stay alert, be ready for anything. At the top of the stairs, he peered around the doorway into the nave and felt his heart stop. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the stained glass windows, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in dark coats that looked expensive and professional. They didn't look like local officials or curious neighbors. They looked like people who solved problems for a living, the kind of problems that required discretion and resources and connections that reached far beyond small-town Colorado. The woman was middle-aged, with silver hair, and the kind of posture that suggested military training or law enforcement background. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, patient and confident, like someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Sullivan," she called out, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Please don't make this difficult. We know what you found down there. We know why you're here. And we know you have questions. Come out, and we'll answer them." Marcus stepped into view, his hands raised but ready to move if necessary. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The woman smiled, but there was something sad about it, like she was apologizing for what came next. "My name is Catherine. I represent certain interests that have been watching this property for a very long time. We've been waiting for someone like you to find it. Someone like me, someone with nothing to lose, someone the world has forgotten, someone who might understand what it means to be abandoned." She gestured around the empty cathedral, at the dust-covered pews and silent altar. "This place has been waiting for you, Marcus, just like you've been waiting for it." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. "I don't understand." Catherine's smile grew wider, but the sadness in her eyes deepened. "You will. But first, you need to know that what you found down there isn't just treasure. It's evidence. Evidence of something that powerful people have spent decades trying to hide. And now that you've found it, your life is never going to be the same." The 2 men moved closer, not threatening but ready, like bodyguards or soldiers waiting for orders. Catherine continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You can walk away now. Take your deed, sell the property to the city, and forget you ever saw what's in those crates. You'll get enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, and nobody will ever bother you again." Marcus looked around the cathedral, at the empty pews and colored light still filtering through stained glass windows, at the carved angels watching from their perches high above. He thought about his small apartment in town, about the pills on his nightstand, and the nightmares that visited him every time he closed his eyes. He thought about the bronze star in his dresser drawer and the friends who didn't make it home from Afghanistan. "And if I don't?" he asked. Catherine's expression grew serious. "Then you become part of something bigger than yourself, something dangerous, something that could get you killed." She paused, studying his face. "But also something that could give your life the meaning you've been looking for since you came home." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, then looked back at the doorway that led to the basement, to the crates full of treasures that somebody had been hiding for 43 years. Whatever was down there, whatever Father Kellner had been protecting, it was important enough that people were still watching, still waiting, still ready to act. "What's really down there?" he asked. Catherine's smile disappeared entirely. "The truth, Marcus, about what happened to Father Thomas Kellner in 1978, about why this cathedral was really abandoned, about where those artifacts came from, and why someone wanted them hidden. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. About a secret that reaches from the Vatican to the Third Reich, to the highest levels of the American government. A secret worth $240 million. Marcus felt his knees go weak. $240 million. He'd known the artifacts in the basement were valuable, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He looked at Catherine, then at the two silent men flanking her, trying to process what he'd just heard. "You're saying there's $250 million worth of treasure hidden under this cathedral?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine nodded slowly. "Conservative estimate, based on what we know is down there. Some of the individual pieces are literally priceless. Artifacts that museums and private collectors would kill for, which, as it turns out, some of them have." The taller of the two men stepped forward. He was built like a linebacker, but moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years in the military. "My name is David Chen," he said, extending a hand. "Former Army intelligence, current freelance researcher specializing in recovered Nazi artifacts. Weakened to nines, 2022. Weakened to nines of self." The second man was shorter but no less imposing, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent time in hard places. "Samuel Rodriguez," he said. 20 years with the FBI, Art Crime Division. Retired last year to work on cases the Bureau couldn't officially touch. Marcus shook their hands, noting the firm grips and direct eye contact. These weren't random treasure hunters or conspiracy theorists. They were professionals, people with credentials and resources. "And you?" he asked Catherine. "Former CIA," she said simply. "Specialized in art, recovery, and cultural preservation. Been tracking this particular collection for 15 years. She gestured toward the basement stairs. "Shall we take a closer look at what you've inherited?" "I'm 7. So, they descended into the crypt together, their flashlight beams dancing across stone walls as their footsteps echoed in the darkness. But Catherine led them past the room where Marcus had found the first crates, deeper into the maze of chambers beneath the cathedral. Father Kellner was thorough, Catherine explained as they walked. He didn't just hide the artifacts randomly. He created a system, a map that only someone with his background could understand. She stopped in front of what looked like a blank stone wall. Religious iconography, biblical references, codes that would be meaningless to treasure hunters, but obvious to a trained theologian. Samuel ran his hands along the stone until he found what he was looking for. He pressed a section decorated with a carved cross, and the wall swung inward with a grinding sound that suggested hidden counterweights and pulleys. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. Beyond was a chamber that stole what little breath he had left. The room was circular, carved from solid rock, with niches built into the walls at regular intervals. Each niche held artifacts that belonged in the world's greatest museums. Golden crosses encrusted with emeralds and rubies caught their flashlight beams like captured stars. Ancient scrolls rested in protective cases made from materials Marcus didn't recognize. Statues that looked like they'd been carved by Renaissance masters stood on marble pedestals, their faces so lifelike they seemed to be watching the newcomers with ancient, patient eyes. Oil paintings of saints and biblical scenes hung in climate-controlled frames, their colors so rich and vibrant they seemed to glow with inner light. Illuminated manuscripts lay open in display cases, their pages covered with gold leaf and pigments that had somehow retained their brilliance across centuries. "My God," Marcus whispered, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Indeed, Catherine said softly. Father Kellner spent 25 years cataloging everything, researching provenance, documenting histories. We estimate there are over 400 individual pieces, dating from the 3rd century after Christ to the 1930s. Conservative value is $240 million. But some of these artifacts are truly priceless. David approached one of the niches and carefully gestured to a small wooden box resting on a velvet cushion. Inside, Marcus could see a ring that seemed to pulse with inner fire. The band was made from white gold or platinum, and the center stone was a diamond larger than his thumb, cut in a style he'd never seen before. "This," David said reverently, "is the ring of Saint Bartholomew. Legend says it was blessed by Christ himself and passed down through the apostolic succession. It disappeared from the Vatican treasury in 1943 during the chaos of World War II. Marcus stared at the ring, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. "Stolen?" Catherine nodded grimly. "Along with everything else you see here. This entire collection represents the greatest art theft in human history." "Marcus, much of it was looted by the Nazis during the war. But some pieces go back even further. Artifacts stolen during the Crusades, treasures seized during the dissolution of monasteries, artwork confiscated during the Spanish Inquisition." She moved to another niche and gestured to a manuscript bound in covers that appeared to be made from solid gold. "This is a 1st-century copy of the Gospel of Mark, written in Aramaic on vellum, made from lambskin. Scholars believed it was destroyed in the fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria. The Catholic Church has been searching for it for over 1,000 years." Samuel's voice was heavy with something between awe and anger. "And they've killed to get it back." Father Kellner wasn't the first person to try to expose this conspiracy, but he was the most careful, the most thorough. Instead of going public immediately, he spent years researching, documenting, building an ironclad case. Marcus walked through the chamber slowly, his injured leg forgotten in the face of what he was seeing. Each artifact represented not just immense monetary value, but centuries of human faith, creativity, and cultural heritage. These weren't just stolen goods, they were stolen pieces of humanity's soul. "How did it all end up here?" he asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Catherine gestured for him to sit on a stone bench carved into the wall. She pulled out a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with handwritten notes in multiple languages. "Father Kellner's research," she explained, opening the journal to a page covered with careful documentation. "After World War II ended, the Allied forces recovered millions of dollars worth of Nazi-looted art and artifacts. Most of it was returned to its rightful owners or placed in public museums. But some pieces were simply too sensitive, too politically dangerous to acknowledge publicly." She pointed to a list of names written in Father Kellner's careful script. High-ranking officials in the American and British governments, working with certain Vatican representatives, decided that some artifacts were too valuable to trust to public institutions. They were afraid of communist infiltration, worried about theft, convinced that only a select few could be trusted with humanity's greatest treasures. "So they stole them themselves," Marcus said, the pieces starting to come together in his mind. "They called it protection," Samuel said bitterly. "A secret trust, with artifacts hidden in secure locations around the world, watched over by carefully chosen guardians. People like Father Kellner." David picked up the story. Father Thomas Kellner was recruited in 1956, fresh out of seminary. Young, idealistic, completely devoted to the church. He was told he was being entrusted with sacred relics that needed to be kept safe from secular authorities who might not understand their true value. Catherine turned to another page in the journal, revealing photographs of a much younger Father Kellner standing beside some of the artifacts Marcus had just seen. The priest looked proud, honored to be chosen for such an important responsibility. For 20 years, he believed he was doing God's work, she continued. He maintained this chamber, protected the artifacts, catalogued new acquisitions, never asked questions about where they came from or why they couldn't be displayed publicly. He was told that someday, when the world was ready, when the political situation stabilized, they would be returned to their rightful places. But something changed, Marcus said, seeing the direction the story was heading. In 1976, everything changed, Samuel confirmed. The church assigned a new priest to assist Father Kellner, someone younger and more curious. Someone who started asking the wrong questions about the artifact's provenance. David opened a folder and pulled out a series of documents, shipping records, insurance forms, testimonies, written in multiple languages. Father Kellner began researching the histories of the pieces in his care, tracing their movements through the war years, discovering the truth about how they'd been acquired. Catherine's voice grew heavy with emotion. He found shipping manifests showing artifacts being smuggled out of concentration camps, insurance documents describing family heirlooms that matched pieces in his collection, testimonies from Holocaust survivors who described in heartbreaking detail the treasures that had been stolen from their families, their communities, their cultures. Marcus felt sick to his stomach. He realized he wasn't protecting sacred relics. He realized he was hiding stolen goods, Samuel said. Worse, he was part of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of government and church hierarchy. People he'd trusted, people he'd devoted his life to serving, had been using him to hide evidence of the greatest cultural theft in human history. Catherine turned to another section of the journal, revealing page after page of meticulous documentation. Names, dates, shipping records, photographs, witness statements. Father Kellner had built a case that would expose not just the theft of the artifacts, but the entire network of officials who had covered it up for decades. So what did he do? Marcus asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. He tried to do the right thing, David said sadly. He documented everything he'd discovered and approached his superiors in the church hierarchy. He thought he could convince them to make things right voluntarily. Return the artifacts to their rightful owners, make public confessions, accept responsibility for their part in the cover-up. He was naive enough to believe that people who had spent 30 years covering up a crime would suddenly develop a conscience, Samuel added bitterly. Catherine closed the journal and looked around the chamber at the artifacts that had cost Father Kellner his life. Instead, they decided he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. On December 15, 1978, Father Thomas Kellner disappeared. Officially, he suffered a mental breakdown and wandered off into the mountains during a snowstorm. His body was never found. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls surrounding them. But he knew they were coming for him. He was smarter than they gave him credit for, David said with something like pride in his voice. Before they could silence him permanently, he hid copies of all his research. Some here in the cathedral, some in other locations we're still trying to find. He turned this chamber into a time capsule, sealing away not just the stolen artifacts, but the evidence of who stole them and why. Catherine stood and walked to the center of the room, where a stone pedestal held what looked like a simple wooden cross. But as Marcus looked closer, he could see that it was anything but simple. The wood was dark with age, carved with symbols and inscriptions that seemed to shift in the flashlight beam. "This was his masterpiece," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Father Kellner used biblical numerology, architectural symbolism, even astronomical alignments, to create a puzzle that could only be solved by someone with deep theological training. The hidden chamber, the arrangement of the artifacts, even the timing of when the chamber would be revealed. He planned it all. The fact that you found it by accident is either miraculous or the biggest coincidence in history, Samuel added, studying Marcus with curious eyes. Marcus thought about the impulse that had led him to bid on the cathedral, the feeling that something had been calling to him from the auction listing. Maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe he was waiting for someone like me. Someone with nothing to lose, David agreed. Someone the world had forgotten. Someone who might understand what it means to be abandoned by the very institutions you devoted your life to serving. Catherine returned to the bench and reopened the journal to a page near the back. "There's more, Marcus. What you've seen so far is just one location. Father Kellner was part of a network, hiding artifacts in multiple sites across the country, maybe across the world." She showed him a page covered with coordinates, addresses, coded references to other locations. Before he disappeared, he left clues to other caches. "We've found evidence of similar collections hidden in monasteries, private homes, abandoned buildings. The scope of this conspiracy is beyond anything we initially imagined." "How many people were involved?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Hundreds," Samuel said simply. "Senators, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, Vatican cardinals, university presidents, museum directors. Anyone with enough power to ask inconvenient questions was either bought off or brought into the conspiracy." "And if they couldn't be bought?" Marcus asked. Catherine's expression darkened. "Then they were dealt with in other ways. Over the past 40 years, there have been journalists who died in suspicious car accidents, researchers who suffered unexpected heart attacks, whistleblowers who simply disappeared. The people behind this have resources and reach that go far beyond what most people can imagine." David pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a series of photographs. Newspaper clippings, obituaries, police reports. "We've documented 17 suspicious deaths connected to people who got too close to exposing this conspiracy. Father Kellner was just the first." Marcus stared at the evidence, feeling the weight of what they were showing him. This wasn't just about stolen art or hidden treasure. This was about a conspiracy that had been murdering people for decades to protect its secrets. "So what's the plan?" he asked. "What are we supposed to do with all this?" The three of them exchanged glances before Catherine answered. "That depends on you, Marcus. You're the legal owner of this property now. Everything in this chamber technically belongs to you. You could sell it all and become one of the richest men in America. Walk away, live quietly. Never think about Father Kellner or stolen artifacts again. But you could also help us finish what Father Kellner started," Samuel said. "Full disclosure. We have journalists standing by, contacts in law enforcement who aren't compromised, legal teams prepared to file simultaneous lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions. We expose everything at once, hit them so hard and from so many directions that they can't cover it up or make it disappear." David leaned forward. "You need to understand the risks, though. These people have killed to protect this secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. Once we go public, you'll be the most hunted man in America. They'll try everything: bribery, blackmail, threats against anyone you care about. And if none of that works," he didn't need to finish the sentence. "Marcus, Understood. On the other hand, Catherine added, you'll also be the most protected. We have allies in this fight. People who've been waiting decades for the chance to bring this conspiracy down. Military personnel who've discovered pieces of the puzzle over the years. Government officials who've been building cases they couldn't pursue officially. Church reformers who want to clean house. Marcus stood and walked around the chamber again, looking at the artifacts that represented centuries of human faith and creativity. He thought about Father Kellner, spending 20 years in loyal service before discovering he was part of a crime, then dying alone in the mountains because he'd tried to do the right thing. He thought about his own service in Afghanistan, the friends he'd lost, the belief that he was fighting for something noble and true. He thought about coming home to a country that had quickly forgotten its veterans, to a system that provided just enough support to keep them quiet, but not enough to truly help them heal. Why me? He asked finally. Why now? You could have bought this place yourselves, could have exposed all this years ago. Catherine smiled sadly. Because we needed someone clean, someone with no connections to the conspiracy, someone who couldn't be dismissed as having an agenda, a veteran who'd served his country honorably, who'd been wounded in service, and then abandoned by the very institutions he'd sacrificed for. Someone like Father Kellner, Samuel added, devoted to a cause larger than himself, betrayed by the people he'd trusted, but still willing to fight for what's right. Marcus thought about the bronze star in his apartment dresser, awarded for actions he'd taken without thinking, moments when training and instinct and simple human decency had driven him to risk everything for people he'd never met. He thought about the empty days since coming home, the sense that his life had lost all meaning, that his service hadn't mattered. There's something else, David said quietly. Something we haven't told you yet. What? Catherine reached into her coat and pulled out a small recording device, its surface worn smooth with handling. Father Kellner left a message. For whoever found this place. For you. For whoever found this place. For whoever found this place. For you. She pressed play, and suddenly the chamber was filled with a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave. It was an older man, speaking with the careful diction of someone accustomed to delivering sermons, but there was pain in the voice, and fear, and something deeper, a desperate hope that someone, someday, would understand. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered what I've spent the last 25 years of my life protecting and documenting. My name is Thomas Kellner, and I want you to know that I'm sorry. Sorry for my part in this crime. Sorry for the years I spent in willful ignorance. Sorry that I wasn't brave enough to act sooner. The voice paused, and Marcus could hear the weight of guilt and regret, the anguish of a man who devoted his life to God only to discover he'd been serving thieves and murderers. But I'm also hopeful. Hopeful that whoever finds this message will have the courage I lacked. The courage to tell the truth, no matter the cost. These artifacts don't belong to governments or private collectors, or even the church. They belong to humanity, to the people whose ancestors created them, to the communities they were stolen from, to anyone who draws strength and inspiration from human creativity and faith. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the sound of wind and what might have been distant thunder. I know that exposing this will be dangerous. I know that powerful people will try to stop you, but I also know that the truth has a power of its own. Once it's released into the world, no amount of money or influence can completely suppress it. Someone, somewhere, will listen. Someone will care. Someone will act. The recording crackled with static, and when Father Kellner's voice returned, it was barely above a whisper, like a man speaking his final confession. I pray that God will forgive me for my cowardice and give you the strength I never had. Do what I couldn't do. Finish what I started. Make sure these treasures find their way home. Make sure the truth isn't buried with me in these mountains. Make sure my death means something. The recording ended, leaving the chamber in absolute silence. Marcus felt tears on his cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. Here was a man who'd spent his final days alone in this place, knowing he was going to die, still hoping that someday someone would have the courage to finish what he'd started. He's been waiting 43 years for someone to hear that message, Catherine said softly, for someone who would understand what he was trying to accomplish. Marcus looked around the chamber one more time, at the artifacts that represented not just immense wealth, but pieces of human history and culture that had been stolen from their rightful owners. He thought about the families who'd lost treasures that had been passed down for generations, about communities whose cultural heritage had been ripped away by greed and power. He thought about Father Kellner, documenting crimes in solitude, knowing it would cost him his life, but doing it anyway, because it was the right thing to do. He thought about the soldiers he'd served with in Afghanistan, young men and women who died believing they were protecting something precious and true. And he thought about the choice he was being asked to make: walk away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life, or risk everything to expose a conspiracy that had been murdering people to protect its secrets for 7 decades. All right, Marcus said finally, his voice steady despite the tears still wet on his face. Tell me what we need to do. The next morning brought the first sign that their discovery hadn't gone unnoticed. Marcus woke in his small apartment to find his front door slightly ajar, even though he was certain he'd locked it the night before. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong. Drawers had been searched with professional care. Cushions moved just enough to suggest a thorough inspection. His few personal belongings shifted with the kind of precision that spoke of trained hands. Whoever had been there wanted him to know they'd been there. His phone rang as he was checking the deadbolt that had somehow been opened without force or damage. Catherine's voice was tight with urgency, stripped of the calm authority she'd displayed in the cathedral. We need to meet. Now. Your place has been compromised, and this is moving faster than we anticipated. They met at a truck stop diner 60 miles outside Pine Ridge, the kind of place that stayed busy enough to provide anonymity, but remote enough to spot surveillance. Catherine arrived with Samuel and David, plus 3 people Marcus hadn't met before. A woman in her 50s with the sharp eyes of a federal agent, a younger man whose nervous energy suggested either journalist or academic, and an elderly gentleman who carried himself with the quiet dignity of old money and older secrets. Marcus, meet Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI Financial Crimes Division, Catherine said, as they slid into a corner booth beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like angry insects. Dr. Michael Chen, art historian from Georgetown University, and Father Antonio Benedetti, Vatican Secret Archives. Agent Torres got straight to business, spreading photographs across the sticky table surface. Someone put a surveillance team on you last night. Professional job, multiple vehicles, rotating shifts. We managed to identify 3 of them through facial recognition. The photographs showed men in expensive suits climbing out of black SUVs, their faces captured by traffic cameras and security feeds. They looked like corporate executives or government officials, not the kind of people Marcus expected to be conducting, breaking, and entering operations. Private security contractors, Samuel explained grimly. The kind that provide deniable services to clients who can't be seen getting their hands dirty. These particular individuals have connections to some very interesting organizations. Dr. Chen opened his laptop and showed Marcus a web of connections that looked like something from a conspiracy thriller. Corporate logos, connected by red lines. Government agencies linked to private foundations. Church hierarchy intertwined with defense contractors. We've been monitoring communications since yesterday, he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The news that someone has discovered Father Kellner's cache is spreading through certain circles very quickly. These are some of the people who are taking a personal interest in your situation. The screen filled with photographs of men and women in expensive clothing. The kind of people who appeared on television news panels or at political fundraisers. Marcus recognized a few faces from newspaper coverage, though he couldn't place the names. Current and former senators, cabinet members, federal judges, Agent Torres explained, her voice heavy with disgust. People who have been part of this conspiracy for decades. People who thought this secret was buried forever, along with Father Kellner. And now they know it's not, Catherine added. Which means you're in immediate danger. They'll start with attempts to buy you off, but when that fails, they'll escalate quickly. Father Benedetti spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of church authority, tempered by genuine sorrow. My son, what you have discovered is a cancer that has been eating at the church for 70 years. There are those within the Vatican who have known of this conspiracy and chosen to remain silent. But there are also those of us who have been working quietly to expose it. Marcus stared at the elderly priest. You're saying the Vatican wants this exposed? Part of the Vatican, Father Benedetti corrected carefully. The Church is not a monolith, despite what many believe. There are factions, just as in any large organization. Those who profit from secrecy and those who believe in transparency. Those who serve power and those who serve truth. Catherine leaned forward, her voice intense. What Father Benedetti is telling you is that this conspiracy doesn't just involve stolen art. It involves money laundering on an international scale, tax evasion, bribery of government officials, and murder. The artifacts are just the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Chen pulled up a new set of documents on his laptop. The Nazi connection goes deeper than we initially explained. During the final years of World War II, as the Third Reich was collapsing, high-ranking SS officers made deals with Allied intelligence agencies. Information in exchange for safe passage, stolen gold in exchange for new identities. Operation Paperclip. Agent Torres said, naming a classified program Marcus had heard whispered about in military circles. The government officially recruited Nazi scientists to work on American weapons programs. Unofficially, they also recruited art dealers, antiquities experts, and treasure hunters who had spent years looting Europe's cultural heritage. Samuel picked up the thread. These Nazi collaborators didn't just bring scientific knowledge to America. They brought maps, shipping manifests, warehouse locations. They told their new handlers about thousands of stolen artifacts hidden in caves, buried in forests, sealed in bank vaults across Europe. And instead of returning these treasures to their rightful owners, Catherine continued, certain American officials decided to claim them for themselves. They used the chaos of post-war reconstruction as cover, established fake ownership documents, created entire fictional provenance chains. Father Benedetti's voice was heavy with shame. The Vatican became complicit when certain members of the hierarchy accepted donations of these stolen artifacts. They told themselves they were preserving humanity's cultural heritage, but in truth, they were laundering stolen goods through religious institutions. Marcus felt sick. How much money are we talking about? Over the past 70 years. Dr. Chen consulted his notes. Conservative estimates suggest more than $20 billion in stolen artifacts have passed through this network. Sold to private collectors, donated to museums, held as collateral for international loans. The economic impact is staggering. Agent Torres spread out another set of documents. But the human cost is even higher. Families destroyed by the theft of generational treasures. Communities stripped of their cultural identity. Scholars and investigators who got too close to the truth and paid with their lives. The weight of what they were telling him settled on Marcus like a physical burden. This wasn't just about hidden treasure or even historical injustice. This was about a conspiracy that was still active, still dangerous, still claiming victims. Why didn't anyone stop this earlier? He asked. People tried, Samuel said grimly. But the network adapted, evolved. When traditional government oversight got too close, they moved operations to private contractors. When law enforcement started asking questions, they bought off prosecutors and judges. When journalists investigated, they faced lawsuits, death threats, or worse. Catherine pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a news article from 5 years ago. Sarah Martinez, investigative reporter for the Washington Post. She was working on a story about Nazi gold when she died in a car accident. Brake failure on a car that had been serviced the day before. Professor William Hayes, art historian at Yale, David added, showing Marcus another obituary. Heart attack at age 42, no previous health problems. He'd been researching stolen Vatican artifacts for a book he was writing. Dr. Emma Richardson, curator at the Metropolitan Museum, Agent Torres, continued the grim roll call. Apparent suicide, though her colleagues insist she had no reason to take her own life. She discovered that several pieces in the museum's collection had questionable provenance. Marcus stared at the photographs of the dead, men and women who had died, because they'd tried to expose the same conspiracy he was now part of. How do you know I won't be next? Because this time is different, Father Benedetti said firmly. You have allies, Marcus, people in positions of power who have been waiting for an opportunity like this. The Vatican is preparing to make a public statement acknowledging our role in this cover-up. Agent Torres has contacts in the Justice Department who are ready to provide protection in exchange for testimony. And we have the evidence, Catherine added. Father Kellner didn't just hide the artifacts. He documented everything. Financial records, shipping manifests, communications between conspirators. We have enough evidence to bring down governments. The diner around them had filled with the lunch crowd. Truckers and traveling salesmen focused on their meals and conversations. None of them had any idea that the people in the corner booth were discussing one of the biggest conspiracies in modern history. Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize. He was about to decline it when Catherine grabbed his wrist. Answer it, she said. But put it on speaker. Marcus accepted the call. Hello? Marcus Sullivan. The voice was cultured, educated, with the kind of authority that came from being obeyed without question. My name is Charles Whitmore. I believe we need to talk. Agent Torres was already running the name through her phone, pulling up information faster than Marcus thought possible. She showed him the screen. Charles Whitmore, former Secretary of Defense, current board member of a dozen major corporations and foundations. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Marcus said carefully. Oh, but we do. Whitmore's voice carried a note of paternal disappointment. You've stumbled into something much larger than you understand, son. Something that involves national security, international relations, and matters far beyond your expertise. Then maybe you should have done a better job keeping it secret. A pause. When Whitmore spoke again, his voice was colder. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to make this very simple. You bought a piece of property that contains certain items of interest to the United States government. We're prepared to offer you $50 million for those items. No questions asked. You can retire comfortably and never think about any of this again. $50 million. More money than Marcus could spend in several lifetimes. Enough to disappear completely. Start fresh somewhere nobody knew his name or his story. And if I say no, he asked, then you'll be making a very foolish decision. One that will have consequences, not just for you, but for anyone foolish enough to help you. The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, processing what had just happened. The first move had been made, the opening gambit in what was clearly going to be a high-stakes game. 50 million, he said quietly. Standard opening offer, Samuel said dismissively. They'll go higher if you negotiate. They've paid more to keep smaller secrets buried. Agent Torres was studying readouts on her tablet. The call came through several encrypted relays, but we were able to trace the origin point. Whitmore called from a private office in the Pentagon. He's not bluffing about having government resources, Catherine said. These people have access to intelligence assets, military contractors, black site budgets. They can make problems disappear in ways that leave no fingerprints. Dr. Chen looked up from his laptop. But they also have vulnerabilities. The network depends on secrecy, on maintaining the illusion that they're legitimate government officials and respected business leaders. Exposure would destroy not just their operations, but their entire lives. Father Benedetti leaned forward. Which is why they're so dangerous now, my son. Cornered animals often fight most viciously. These people have everything to lose. What happens next will turn this quiet investigation into an all-out war, expose corruption at the highest levels of government, and put Marcus in the crosshairs of people who have killed to keep their secrets buried. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true tales. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of moving between safe houses and encrypted communications. Agent Torres had arranged for Marcus to be placed in protective custody, but it was clear that traditional law enforcement resources were insufficient for the scale of the threat they were facing. We have a problem, Catherine announced during their third location change in 2 days. Someone inside the Bureau leaked information about our investigation. 3 of our safe houses have been compromised, and 2 of our contacts have gone dark. They were meeting in an abandoned warehouse outside Denver. The kind of place that would be demolished within months, but provided temporary security from electronic surveillance. Marcus sat on a shipping crate, surrounded by people whose lives had become as uncertain as his own. How do we know who to trust? He asked. We don't, Samuel admitted. That's what makes this conspiracy so effective. They've had 70 years to infiltrate government agencies, recruit assets, compromise potential whistleblowers. Anyone could be working for them. Dr. Chen had been quiet for most of the conversation, focused on his laptop screen. Now he looked up with excitement in his eyes. I think I found something that could change everything. The coordinates from Father Kellner's cross led me to research some of the other cache locations. I've been cross-referencing shipping records, and I found a pattern. He turned his laptop so everyone could see the screen, which showed a map of the United States dotted with red markers. Each location corresponds to a major transportation hub from the 1950s. Ports, airports, rail terminals. They weren't just hiding artifacts randomly, they created a distribution network. Agent Torres studied the map. Distribution network for what? Money laundering, Dr. Chen said excitedly. Think about it. You have billions of dollars worth of stolen artifacts that you can't sell openly. But you can use them as collateral for loans, insurance policies, investment funds. You can donate them to museums and claim massive tax deductions. You can trade them for political favors, business deals, international agreements. Catherine's eyes widened as she understood the implications. The artifacts weren't the end goal. They were the means. A way to convert stolen cultural heritage into liquid political and economic power. Which explains why they've been so desperate to keep this secret, Father Benedetti added. If this network is exposed, it's not just about returning stolen art. It's about unwinding decades of illegal financial transactions, fraudulent tax claims, corrupted government contracts. Marcus's phone rang again. This time the number showed up as his own apartment's landline, a number he'd disconnected months ago. He answered cautiously. Marcus. The voice was different this time, younger, with a slight accent he couldn't place. This is Elena Vasquez. I worked with your friend Catherine a long time ago. I need to meet with you. Alone. Catherine grabbed the phone. Elena? How did you get this number? Where are you? Close enough to know that your current location isn't as safe as you think it is. Marcus needs to meet me at the old mining museum outside Golden in 2 hours. Alone? Catherine, they're tracking your electronic signatures. The line went dead. Catherine stared at the phone, her face pale. Elena Vasquez was my partner when I was CIA, she said slowly. She disappeared 8 years ago while investigating international art smuggling. We assumed she was dead, and now she's contacting us at the exact moment we're investigating the biggest art conspiracy in history, Samuel said suspiciously. That's either incredible timing or a trap. It's a trap, Agent Torres said firmly. Has to be. Dead agents don't just call out of nowhere. But Marcus was already standing, checking his jacket for his keys and wallet. I'm going to meet her. Absolutely not, Catherine said. It's too dangerous. Elena's been missing for 8 years. Even if she's really alive, we don't know what's happened to her, who she might be working for now. She said they're tracking your electronic signatures, Marcus pointed out. That means staying here is just as dangerous as meeting her. And if she really was your partner, if she's been investigating this conspiracy for 8 years, she might have information we need. Dr. Chen looked up from his computer. Actually, there might be a way to verify her identity remotely. If she really is Elena Vasquez, she would know certain operational details that weren't in any files, things that only someone who worked directly with Catherine would remember. They spent 30 minutes developing a series of verification questions, details from old operations that only the real Elena would know. Marcus memorized them along with emergency signals and extraction protocols, though everyone acknowledged that if this was a trap, protocols wouldn't help him. The drive to Golden took him through mountain passes that reminded him of Afghanistan. Winding roads between steep slopes where ambushes would be easy to set up and impossible to escape. He found himself checking his mirrors constantly, looking for the kind of surveillance that would indicate he was being followed. The mining museum was closed for the season, its parking lot empty, except for a single car with Colorado plates. A woman sat on a bench near the entrance, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing hiking clothes that looked well used. She could have been any tourist taking a break from exploring the mountains. Marcus approached carefully, his hand near the pistol Catherine had insisted he carry. "Elena?" The woman looked up, and he saw eyes that had seen too much, aged beyond their years but still sharp with intelligence. "You must be Marcus." Catherine always did have good instincts about people. She gestured for him to sit beside her on the bench. Up close, he could see scars on her hands and a faded mark on her neck that looked like it might have come from a knife. 8 years, she said without preamble. 8 years I've been dead to the world, building a new identity, tracking this conspiracy from the inside. Do you know how many times I wanted to contact Catherine to let her know I was alive? Marcus asked the first verification question, a detail about an operation in Prague that only Elena and Catherine would remember. She answered without hesitation, providing information that only someone who had been there could know. "The night Catherine told you about," Elena continued, "when we thought we'd lost the money that had been stolen from a Jewish family during the war. We found it 3 days later in the private collection of a Swiss banker. But Catherine blamed herself for weeks." That detail wasn't in any of their verification questions, but it had the ring of truth, the kind of personal information that couldn't be faked. "Why the secrecy?" Marcus asked. "Why not contact Catherine directly?" Elena's expression grew grim. "Because I've spent 8 years learning exactly how deep this conspiracy goes, how many people we trusted who were actually working for them. Catherine's communications are monitored, her movements tracked. The only reason I could contact you is because you're new to this, haven't been compromised yet." She pulled a small device from her pocket, something that looked like a modified phone. "This is 8 years of investigation. Financial records, shipping manifests, recorded conversations, photographic evidence. Everything I've been able to gather about the network while pretending to be dead." Marcus took the device, surprised by its weight. "How did you stay hidden for 8 years? By letting them think they'd won," Elena said simply. "The operation I was investigating when I disappeared, it was a setup. They knew I was getting close, so they arranged for me to die in an explosion that left no recoverable body. I barely escaped, but I realized it was an opportunity. If they thought I was dead, I could investigate freely." "What did you find?" Elena's smile was bitter. "I found that what you've discovered is just one small piece of a much larger operation. The artifacts in Father Kellner's cathedral, they're valuable, but they're not the real prize. The real prize is the financial network that was built around them." She gestured toward the mountains surrounding them. "Hidden all through these mountains, in caves and abandoned mines and forgotten buildings, there are caches of documents, financial records going back 70 years, tracking billions of dollars in illegal transactions, Swiss bank accounts, offshore corporations, real estate deals, government contracts. The stolen art was just the seed money for something much bigger." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How much bigger?" Marcus felt. "Try $20 billion in current assets," Elena said, "spread across hundreds of shell companies, invested in everything from defense contracts to pharmaceutical research to real estate development. These people don't just have influence, Marcus. They own entire sectors of the economy." She stood and walked to the edge of the parking lot, looking out at the mountain vista. "Father Kellner discovered one cache. I've found evidence of 17 others. And I think there are more." 17. distributed across 12 states, 2 Canadian provinces, and at least 3 European countries, each one containing not just artifacts but financial records, communications, evidence of crimes that would bring down governments if they were exposed. Marcus joined her at the Overlook, trying to process the scope of what she was describing. "Why are you telling me this? Why not take it to the authorities yourself?" Elena laughed. But there was no humor in it. "Which authorities? The FBI agents who've been compromised by the network? The federal judges who've been receiving donations for decades? The senators whose campaigns have been funded by shell companies connected to stolen Nazi gold?" She turned to face him, her expression intense. "The only way this works is if we expose everything at once, hit so many targets simultaneously that they can't cover them all up. And that requires someone they haven't had time to compromise yet. Someone like you. What do you need me to do?" Elena handed him a small key, old-fashioned brass, like the one that had opened the cathedral. "There's a safety deposit box in a bank in Denver. Inside are copies of everything I've collected over 8 years, plus detailed instructions for how to contact journalists, law enforcement officers, and government officials who can be trusted. People who've been waiting for evidence like this." Marcus took the key, feeling its weight. Another key, another secret, another choice that would determine not just his own fate but the fate of everyone connected to this conspiracy. "Why trust me?" he asked. "You don't know me." Elena smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Because Catherine trusts you, and because I've been watching you for the past week. You could have taken Whitmore's money and disappeared. You could have sold the artifacts and lived like a king. Instead, you chose to fight for people you've never met, for justice you'll probably never see." She started walking back toward her car, then stopped. "One more thing, Marcus. When this goes public, and it will go public, remember that you're not just exposing a conspiracy. You're giving back pieces of people's souls. Every artifact you return, every truth you reveal, you're healing wounds that have been bleeding for 70 years. As she drove away, Marcus stood alone in the parking lot, holding the key to 8 years of secrets. In his other pocket, his phone was buzzing with missed calls from Catherine, Samuel, Agent Torres. They would be worried, wanting to debrief him, planning their next move. But for a moment, he allowed himself to stand still in the mountain silence, thinking about the choice that lay before him. 8 years ago, a woman had given up her life, her identity, her connection to everyone she cared about, to gather the evidence he now held. 43 years ago, a priest had died alone in the snow rather than let this conspiracy continue. Now it was his turn to choose. Safety or justice, comfort or truth, his own life or the chance to heal wounds that had been bleeding since before he was born. Marcus Sullivan, broken veteran with nothing left to lose, had become the keeper of secrets that could reshape the world. And for the first time since Afghanistan, he knew exactly what he had to do. The safety deposit box in Denver contained 8 years of Elena's life reduced to documents, photographs, and digital files that could bring down governments. Marcus sat in the bank's private viewing room, surrounded by evidence of the greatest conspiracy in modern history, knowing that what he did next would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone connected to this web of corruption. His hands shook as he photographed each document, uploaded files to encrypted servers that Elena had established, and followed her detailed instructions for contacting journalists and law enforcement officials around the world. By the time he finished, it was past midnight, and he knew there was no turning back. The first story broke at 6 a.m. Eastern Time on a Tuesday morning that would be remembered as the day the world learned the truth. The New York Times led with Cathedral case. Veteran discovers $240 million Nazi treasure. Exposes 70-year conspiracy. CNN opened its morning show with exclusive footage from inside the secret chamber. The Washington Post published Father Kellner's complete research alongside Elena's 8 years of financial documentation. Within hours, the story had gone global. BBC News interviewed Holocaust survivors who recognized family heirlooms in the photographs. French television showed shipping records proving that priceless artifacts had been smuggled out of concentration camps. Swiss authorities announced investigations into bank accounts that had been dormant for decades. Marcus watched it all unfold from a secure FBI facility outside Denver, surrounded by federal marshals and agents who were still trying to determine who could be trusted. The phone calls started within minutes of the first broadcast. Mr. Sullivan. The voice belonged to someone Marcus didn't recognize, but the tone carried absolute authority. This is Senator Patricia Hammond, chair of the Intelligence Committee. I need you to understand that what you've done today has serious national security implications. Agent Torres, who was monitoring the call, shook her head vigorously and made cutting motions across her throat. But Marcus had already decided to hear what the senator had to say. Senator, with all due respect, covering up the theft of cultural artifacts from Holocaust victims doesn't sound like national security to me. It sounds like a crime. You don't understand the complexities involved, Hammond replied, her voice taking on a note of condescension. Some of these operations were authorized at the highest levels of government. Exposing them could damage relationships with allied nations, compromise ongoing intelligence operations, put American lives at risk. Marcus thought about Father Kellner's recording, about Elena's 8 years of hiding, about all the people who had died trying to expose this conspiracy. How many American lives were put at risk when you allowed Nazi war criminals to live freely in this country? How many families have spent 70 years wondering what happened to their cultural heritage? The line went dead. Within 24 hours, the arrests began. Charles Whitmore was taken into custody at his Virginia estate, along with 2 former cabinet members and a sitting federal judge. Swiss authorities froze dozens of bank accounts containing hundreds of millions of dollars in suspicious assets. Vatican officials announced a full internal investigation and promised to return any artifacts that could be verified as stolen. But the network fought back with resources and ruthlessness that surprised even Elena, who had spent 8 years studying their methods. They're not just trying to discredit the evidence, Catherine explained during a secure video conference from an undisclosed location. They're trying to discredit you personally. Be prepared for everything you've ever done to be scrutinized, twisted, and used against you. The character assassination began with anonymous leaks to right-wing media outlets, suggesting that Marcus was mentally unstable, that his PTSD had caused him to fabricate elaborate conspiracy theories. Then came the personal attacks. Stories about his struggles with depression, his isolation since returning from Afghanistan, his financial problems before discovering the cathedral. Troubled Vet's Treasure Fantasy read one headline. PTSD patient hallucinates Nazi conspiracy, claimed another. Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring social media and news coverage, showed Marcus the flood of disinformation that was being spread online. They're using sophisticated bots and paid trolls to amplify these false narratives, making it look like public opinion is turning against you. But for every attack, there was also support. Holocaust survivors appeared on television to thank Marcus for helping recover their families' stolen treasures. Art historians praised his courage in exposing decades of academic fraud. Veterans organizations rallied to defend one of their own against what they recognized as a coordinated smear campaign. "You've started something that can't be stopped," Agent Torres told him during one of their daily briefings. "Even if they manage to discredit you personally, the evidence speaks for itself. We've already recovered over 200 stolen artifacts and traced financial transactions worth billions of dollars." The breakthrough came when Elena emerged from 8 years of hiding to testify before a joint congressional committee. Her appearance was broadcast live, and her calm, detailed presentation of evidence left no doubt about the scope of the conspiracy. "For 8 years, I've lived as a ghost," she said, looking directly into the cameras. "I watched from the shadows as the people who tried to kill me continued to profit from stolen treasure, continued to corrupt our institutions, continued to deny justice to families who had already lost everything." She held up a photograph of Marcus standing beside Father Kellner's wooden cross. This man could have taken $50 million and disappeared. Instead, he chose to fight for people he's never met, for justice he'll never personally benefit from. That's not the action of someone suffering from delusions. That's the action of a hero. The tide of public opinion began to shift. Social media filled with messages of support for Marcus and demands for accountability from government officials. Peaceful protests formed outside federal buildings, with demonstrators carrying signs reading, "Return the treasure," and "Justice for Father Kellner." But the real turning point came when Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, including his allies. "I'm going back to Pine Ridge," he announced during a strategy meeting with his legal team. "I'm going back to the Cathedral." "Mackett subscribe?" "Absolutely not," Agent Torres said immediately. "It's too dangerous. These people have shown they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. Going back to where this started makes you an easy target." Catherine agreed. "Marcus, you need to stay in protective custody until the trials are over. The evidence is strong enough to convict without putting you at additional risk." But Marcus had made up his mind. This isn't just about convictions and prison sentences. It's about what happens next. Father Kellner didn't die just to expose a conspiracy. He died to make sure those artifacts could go home. And that's not happening while they're locked up in FBI evidence rooms. Dr. Chen looked up from his laptop. Actually, Marcus might have a point. The legal process for returning the artifacts to their rightful owners could take years, maybe decades. But if he maintains legal ownership of the cathedral site, he could establish a foundation, create a process for repatriation that doesn't depend on government bureaucracy. Father Benedetti, who had been following the proceedings from the Vatican, appeared on the video conference. The Church would support such a foundation. "We have contacts with Jewish communities worldwide, with museums and cultural institutions. We could help ensure the artifacts are returned to the people and communities they were stolen from." Agent Torres shook her head. "The security risks are still enormous, even with federal protection, even with media attention. There are people who would kill to prevent those artifacts from being returned. Then we make it impossible for them to attack without exposing themselves," Marcus said. "Full transparency, live cameras, public access. Turn the cathedral into a symbol of justice instead of secrecy." 3 months later, Marcus stood once again in St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, but it was transformed beyond recognition. The windows had been repaired, their stained glass restored to its original brilliance. The wooden pews gleamed with fresh polish, and the stone walls had been cleaned until they seemed to glow in the colored light. The secret chamber beneath the altar, had been converted into a memorial and museum space, with climate-controlled displays showing some of the recovered artifacts alongside the stories of the families they'd been stolen from. Interactive exhibits told the story of Father Kellner's investigation, Elena's 8 years underground, and the international effort to expose the conspiracy. But it wasn't just a museum. It was a working foundation, with researchers and genealogists helping to trace the provenance of thousands of stolen artifacts, with legal teams working to return treasures to their rightful owners, with educators developing curricula to teach young people about the importance of cultural preservation. The Kellner Foundation for Cultural Justice, Marcus explained to a group of visiting reporters, named after a man who gave his life to ensure that stolen treasures could find their way home. The foundation had been funded by the sale of artifacts that couldn't be traced to specific owners, by donations from governments seeking to atone for past complicity, and by court-ordered restitution from convicted conspirators. But more importantly, it had been supported by volunteers from around the world who believed in its mission. Samuel Rodriguez had left the FBI to become the foundation's security director, overseeing protection for both the artifacts and the people working to return them. Catherine had taken a position as director of investigations, continuing the work she'd started with Elena years earlier. Dr. Chen headed the research division, using cutting-edge technology to trace the histories of stolen cultural objects. And Elena Vasquez, no longer dead to the world, served as the Foundation's Director of International Operations, coordinating with law enforcement agencies and cultural institutions worldwide. It's not just about the artifacts, Marcus told a packed auditorium during the Foundation's first annual conference. It's about healing. Every treasure we return, every family we reunite with their heritage, every truth we uncover, we're healing wounds that have been bleeding for generations. The audience included Holocaust survivors who had lived to see their families' treasures returned, museum directors who were re-examining their collections for stolen pieces, and law enforcement officers who were applying lessons learned from the conspiracy to combat ongoing cultural crimes. But perhaps the most important people in the audience were the young veterans who had come to Pine Ridge to volunteer with the Foundation. Men and women who, like Marcus, had returned from service feeling forgotten and purposeless, but who had found new meaning in the work of cultural restoration and justice. "We call it the Healing Corps," explained Jennifer Martinez, a former Army medic who now led the Foundation's Veteran Outreach Program. Veterans working to heal cultural wounds, to restore what was broken, to ensure that history's victims are not forgotten. The program had grown beyond anything Marcus had imagined. Veterans with PTSD found therapeutic value in the careful, methodical work of cataloging and preserving artifacts. Former military linguists used their skills to translate historical documents. Combat engineers applied their expertise to restoring damaged cultural sites. "It gives us purpose again," said Robert Kim, a Marine veteran who had struggled with depression after returning from Iraq. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're building something meaningful." The cathedral itself had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, not for religious reasons, but as a symbol of what was possible when people chose truth over comfort, justice over security. Visitors came from around the world to see where the conspiracy had been exposed, to pay their respects to Father Kellner's memory, to witness the ongoing work of cultural restoration. Marcus had moved into the renovated rectory, not because he needed to live at the cathedral, but because he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The building that had once housed a secret conspiracy now served as headquarters for an organization dedicated to transparency and justice. His days were filled with work he'd never imagined doing. Meeting with diplomats about repatriation agreements, consulting with historians about artifact authenticity, testifying at trials of former conspirators. But somehow, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "You've changed," Catherine observed during one of their regular strategy meetings. "Not just what you do, but who you are." The broken veteran who bought this place for $1 doesn't exist anymore. Marcus considered this as he looked around the conference room they'd built in what had once been Father Kellner's private study. The walls were lined with photographs of returned artifacts, thank you letters from grateful families, and newspaper clippings documenting the ongoing trials and investigations. "Maybe I was never really broken," he said slowly. "Maybe I was just waiting for something worth fixing." The foundation's work continued to expand. They'd established partnerships with universities to research the history of cultural theft. They'd created educational programs that taught young people about the importance of preserving cultural heritage. They'd even developed new technologies for tracking and recovering stolen artifacts in real time. But for Marcus, the most meaningful moments came when they were able to return specific items to the families they'd been stolen from. Like the day when Sarah Goldman, granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, was reunited with a menorah that had been passed down through her family for 12 generations. She wept as she held it for the first time, running her fingers over silver that her great-grandmother had polished before the Nazis came to take everything away. "My bubby used to tell me stories about this menorah," Sarah said through her tears. "I thought it was lost forever. I thought that part of our family history was gone." Or the afternoon when representatives from a village in Poland came to collect religious artifacts that had been stolen from their church during the war. The elderly priest who had traveled to Colorado for the ceremony broke down when he saw chalices and candlesticks that he remembered from his childhood. "We thought God had abandoned us when they took these things," he said in halting English. "But maybe he was just waiting for the right person to bring them home." These were the moments that reminded Marcus why he'd chosen to fight instead of taking the money and disappearing. Every returned artifact was a victory against the forces that had tried to erase history, steal culture, and profit from genocide. The conspiracy trials continued for 2 years, resulting in convictions of dozens of officials and the recovery of billions in stolen assets. But more importantly, they led to systematic reforms in how cultural artifacts were acquired, displayed, and protected by museums and private collectors. New laws required extensive provenance research before any cultural artifact could be legally sold or displayed. International agreements streamlined the process for returning stolen items to their countries of origin. Educational programs ensured that future generations would understand the importance of protecting cultural heritage. "We've changed more than just laws," Dr. Chen explained during the Foundation's second annual report to donors and supporters. "We've changed how people think about cultural property, about ownership, about responsibility to preserve the past for the future." The cathedral itself had become a model for cultural preservation and education. The restoration had been completed using traditional techniques and materials, ensuring that the building would survive for future generations. But more importantly, it had been transformed into a living symbol of justice and healing. The main nave now served as a concert hall and lecture space, hosting performances by musicians whose cultural traditions had been targeted by various regimes throughout history. The bell tower had been restored to working order, its bronze bells ringing out across the mountains every Sunday at noon, in memory of Father Kellner and all those who had died trying to expose the truth. And in the chamber where the conspiracy's secrets had been hidden, An eternal flame burned next to a plaque that read simply, "In memory of all whose voices were silenced, whose treasures were stolen, whose stories were forgotten. They are silent no more." 5 years after that snowy December day when Marcus had raised his hand at a courthouse auction, he stood once again in the cathedral's main doorway. But this time, he wasn't alone. The building buzzed with activity as researchers, volunteers, and visitors from around the world worked together on the ongoing mission of cultural restoration. A group of high school students from Denver was cataloging recently discovered artifacts, learning about history through direct contact with the objects that had shaped it. A team of international lawyers was preparing cases for the return of stolen art to museums in Eastern Europe. A Holocaust survivor was sharing her story with a documentary crew, explaining what it meant to hold a family treasure that had been lost for 70 years. "Any regrets?" Elena asked, joining him at the entrance. Marcus thought about the question seriously. He thought about the comfortable anonymity he'd given up, the peaceful obscurity he'd traded for a life under constant scrutiny. He thought about the nightmares that still visited him sometimes, though they were different now, dreams about the people who had died trying to expose this conspiracy, rather than memories of roadside bombs in Afghanistan. But then he looked at the activity surrounding him, at the young veterans who had found new purpose in the Foundation's work, at the families who had been reunited with pieces of their heritage, at the researchers and educators who were ensuring that these crimes would never be forgotten or repeated. "No," he said finally. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the stained glass windows in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus walked through the cathedral one more time before heading home to his restored rectory. The building hummed with the kind of purposeful energy that comes from meaningful work, from people united around something larger than themselves. He paused at Father Kellner's memorial, where fresh flowers had been left by a visitor who had traveled from Germany to thank the Foundation for returning her grandfather's prayer book. The wooden cross that had unlocked so many secrets sat in a place of honor, surrounded by photographs of the artifacts it had helped to recover. "We finished what you started," Marcus said quietly, as he did every evening. "But more than that, we've started something new, something you would have been proud of." Outside, the mountain air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees and snow. The same landscape that had witnessed Father Kellner's final days now looked down on a thriving community dedicated to justice and healing. Marcus had learned many things over the past 5 years. He'd learned that broken things could be restored if you had the right tools and enough patience. He'd learned that the most valuable treasures weren't always made of gold and jewels, but of truth and justice, and the courage to fight for what's right. But most importantly, he'd learned that purpose wasn't something you found. It was something you built, day by day, choice by choice, one act of courage at a time. The veteran who had bought a cathedral for $1 had found something worth far more than $240 million. He'd found his calling, his community, his reason for being. And in the process, he'd helped heal wounds that had been bleeding for generations. As he walked up the path to his front door, Marcus carried with him the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new artifacts to research, new families to reunite with their heritage. The work would never be finished. There were too many stolen treasures, too many broken histories, too many silenced voices waiting to be heard. But that was okay. Marcus Sullivan, former soldier, former broken veteran, current guardian of humanity's cultural heritage, had finally found something worth spending the rest of his life building. Anyone can discover treasure if they're brave enough to look beneath the surface and wise enough to know that some things are too valuable to keep hidden. As the stars came out over the Colorado mountains, Marcus knew that the real treasure had never been what he'd found beneath the cathedral's altar. The real treasure was what he'd chosen to do with it. Because sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made in hidden chambers or secret vaults. Sometimes they're made in the choice to stand up when standing down would be easier, to speak truth when silence would be safer, to fight for justice when taking the money would be simpler. The cathedral bells rang out across the valley, their bronze voices carrying a message of hope and healing into the mountain night. And in that sound, Marcus heard the voices of everyone who had died trying to expose this conspiracy. Everyone whose heritage had been stolen and returned. Everyone whose story had finally been told. The broken veteran had become the healer. The forgotten soldier had become the keeper of memory. The man who had nothing left to lose had found something worth everything. The knowledge that his life had meaning, that his choices mattered, that even one person could change the world. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories that will inspire you to believe in the power of courage and justice. Click now to continue this amazing journey. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that broken things can be made whole again, that stolen treasures can find their way home, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones the world needs most.